All right, good morning, everybody. Sorry for the late start. We had some technical difficulties. So welcome to this week's Grand Rounds. I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Doblin, PhD. He founded the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies in 1986. He's now the Chief Executive Officer. He got his doctorate in public policy at Harvard, interestingly enough. Yeah. All right, here's Dr. Doblin. We have the slides.
Okay. Is there some way I can adjust? Because there's a lot of them. Yeah, quick review. Well, first, just let me say how much I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to speak with you, and that we have been developing MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD at the nonprofit that I started in 1986. But it wasn't that we invented this idea of MDMA for PTSD. It really began earlier in the middle 70s, early 80s. And there was, MDMA was legal at the time. And it was actually a therapy drug before it became a party drug under the name of ecstasy. So what we're trying to do is really bring it back to being a therapy drug again. And it was used with some veterans. It was 1992. So 40 years ago was when I first learned about MDMA, and it had incredible therapeutic potential. And it was, of all the psychedelics, it's the mildest, it's the most gentle, it's the easiest to integrate. Some people even started trying to say that it's not a psychedelic, that it's not like a classic psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin, where it interrupts your logical train of thought in certain ways, and you have visual imagery, things like that. It's quieter, but incredibly profound. And so today, I'll be sharing with you where we're at with the research and what we're doing also inside the Veterans Administration and elsewhere to try to do the studies. And we are, yesterday was just an incredible day for us because it was great, thank you. It was the last data point in our second phase 3 study. It was gathered yesterday. So we're anticipating by early 2024, if the data really looks good for the second phase 3 study, that we should have FDA approval. So yeah, these opinions are mine. And the drug, of course, is not approved by the FDA yet. That's what we've been working on. And I'd like to do a bit of neuroscience about how this works. I'll summarize the evidence from our first phase 3 study that we published, and I'll explain a bit about future research as well. Now, Stan Grof is the world's leading LSD researcher. He's now 91 years old. He started work in the 70s. In the 50s in the Czech Republic, and then when the Russians moved into Czechoslovakia, he escaped and came to Johns Hopkins, and then led the research there for a couple of years until it was shut down. And now what he's trying to do is just educate people. He's written a lot of books. He's been the mentor of most of the therapists that have started the pioneering work with psychedelics. And what he said is that psychedelics are the study of the mind, but the microscope is the biology and the telescope is to astronomy. And that's a pretty bold claim, but we do know that when the telescope was invented with Galileo, that the discoveries that he made through the telescope were controversial, you could say, the least, because they challenged the religious view of the day that the Earth was the center of the universe. And so Father Bruno, who was a follower of Galileo, was actually burned at the stake by the Inquisition. So we don't think of the telescope anymore as a controversial technology. We're just amazed at what we're able to learn from it. And so I think that psychedelics may be the same in that it's been a controversial technology used for thousands of years by people because of some of the things that came up from it. But I'm hoping that over time we will see the psychedelics as kind of like a neutral tool for helping us understand, and in particular, understanding the mind. I was just giving a talk at the Allen Institute in Seattle, which was a neuroscience temple for neuroscience, funded by Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft. And so they had us a 2-day conference. The first day was neuroscience, which we sort of talked about was the study of the brain, and then the second day was about psychedelics, both MDMA and psilocybin, to think about it as the study of the mind. So we're hoping to be here also in the Center for Research and have a lot of its potentials explored. Just to give you a bit of a sense of the psychedelic renaissance that we talk about, this is the Web of Science. You can see that there's a small peak. Yeah, so you can see there's a small peak of research right here. And this is right where the backlash happens. And then there's basically no research declining. And almost all of these papers are about the risks, LSD chromosome damage, which is not true, but a lot of things. And then what happened here in 1990 that's led to this incredible explosion of research was that the FDA, the division of the FDA that regulated psychedelics, switched to a new group. And this new group, called the Pilot Drug Evaluation Staff, they decided that they wanted to open the door to psychedelic research again after 20 years of suppression. And so that's what really led to this research all over the world. So it's really the courage of some people at the FDA to open the door to psychedelic research. And in 1992, they had a formal FDA advisory committee meeting, and the National Center on Drug Abuse also had a 2-day meeting with their animal researchers. And they felt that the data that they were generating about psychedelics in animal was becoming increasingly difficult to interpret, because unless you can correlate it with human data, you don't know really what you've got. So both the National Center on Drug Abuse and the FDA formally opened the door to psychedelic research 30 years ago. And you can see the consequences of that. This is now another illustration of just the studies into therapeutic potentials of psychedelics. And you can see also that they have been dramatically increasing. This was made in the middle of 2021. So the number of studies in 2021 at the end there is actually way more. This is only partial here. So that there is all over the world now a new understanding that these psychedelics, under certain conditions, and I'll explain more, but it's mainly with therapy, not the drugs by themselves, have incredible therapeutic potential, distinct in a way from esketamine, which has been approved, but it's been approved without therapy. And so most of the clinics, there's now 500 or 600 or 700 ketamine clinics in America, a lot of them are moving to combine therapy with ketamine. And so that's where you end up getting better results, more durable results, and I think it's, you can imagine it's a classic pharma play, which is that they don't really understand psychotherapy, and so they made ketamine, esketamine, into a medicine without psychotherapy, but as a consequence, you need more ketamine. And when you combine it with therapy, more of the money and the resources go to the therapist rather than the pharma company. So a lot of the ketamine clinics are recognizing, when they focus on patient outcomes, that it's really in combination with therapy. This is just a brief review of the different psychedelics and the different clinical conditions that they're being used for. I won't go through all of them, but you can see that the concept here is that psychedelics enhance psychotherapy, and psychotherapy itself can be used for a wide range of things. And in addition, there's neuroplasticity. This is why psychedelics might be really good for TBI. There's a lot of different possibilities. And what's in the future, you can see on the right-hand side, this idea of fibromyalgia stuff, that what we haven't really done is the mind-body stuff. The psychedelic field so far is looking for, depression, OCD, mental illnesses, but a new chapter will be looking at these kind of psychosomatic illnesses that have a psychosomatic component to it. This is just the references for all those papers before. This happened to me a couple weeks ago. I got an email from a Danish veteran who had spent time in Afghanistan. And this was a really sad story, is that this Danish veteran had gone for underground MDMA therapy, and it had helped him quite a bit. And he was able to sort of get his feet under himself again, and really able to work and to live and to lose weight, and was really doing well. But his therapist said that she would no longer work with him if he was doing illegal underground therapy. And then in order to get benefits from the Danish government as well for the disability for PTSD, he had to give it up. And so he agreed to do that. And then for the next couple of years, he ended up trying various different therapies, and they didn't really work for him. And he felt there was no way back to MDMA, so he committed suicide. And so his mother put this in the put the MAPS logo up on his tombstone. And then she wrote to me, I hope that Fiona Story can make a contribution to the process of making MDMA therapy legal and available so a lot of people can be helped. So he was helped, but again, it's not like it's one dose miracle cure. You need a lot of work on integration, and often people do need sometimes more than 2 sessions. So he had the hint of help, but then he wasn't able to continue. And so this is a tragic story, and I really hope that we can avoid a lot of these suicides. MDMA really gives people hope, and this is something that inspires me to keep going. So MAPS, they started in 1986. MDMA was criminalized in 85. And there was a hearing in front of the Drug Enforcement Administration about whether the therapeutic use of MDMA should stay legal. And we actually won the hearing. The DEA administrative law judge said MDMA should be Schedule 3. But the administrator of the DEA rejected the recommendation and criminalized both ecstasy, recreational use, and also therapeutic use of MDMA. And that's where I realized that the only way to bring this back was through science, through medicine, through the FDA. MDMA is invented by Merck in 1912, so it's in the public domain. So the only way to really do this at that time was through philanthropy. And that's why it's been difficult for us, of course, to raise the money. We've raised about $135 million in grants and donations. This is an artist, Alex Gray, and this is his interpretation of the MAPS logo. And the reason I'm showing this here is that the hands are in front and the swirly psychedelic stuff is in the back. And this is just to emphasize that it's the therapy, it's the human connection that really determines whether there's therapeutic outcomes. It's not just here's a drug and now people are going to get better. It's not that at all. You can give somebody the drug and they can actually get worse if they're not ready to process the emotions, if they're not supported, if they don't feel safe. So this just again emphasizes that what we're talking about is really therapy. And this is actually why I think it will be easy for both the FDA and the DEA to regulate post-approval, because what we're proposing is that it only be available under direct supervision of trained therapists post-approval. So we have mostly been nonprofit funded through donations. We wanted to innovate in 2 different ways. One was developing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, in particular MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, but also we wanted to innovate in marketing a pharmaceutical where instead of putting profits first, we would put public benefit first. So we created the for-profit Public Benefit Corp in 2014, and that's our pharmaceutical arm. We've got about 150 people working in the Public Benefit Corp and about 35 people working in the nonprofit. And we have recently opened the door to investors, and we have roughly $50 million in royalty share. They don't have any ownership or controls. So right now, the nonprofit is the 100% owner of the Public Benefit Corp. I'm not sure if we can continue that, but we are very much trying to do whatever we can through philanthropy and to make this more widely available. So as I said, we've raised since 1986 135 million in grants and donations. We do have a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan that I'm not going to talk about the rest here for a cannabis study in veterans with PTSD. So Michigan legalized marijuana, and part of the initiative that did that, they had to put $20 million a year for 2 years into veterans' mental health and reducing veteran suicide. So we got a $12.9 million grant, and part of it will be conducted inside the Tampa VA, the Ann Arbor VA. But marijuana, like SSRIs, are palliative, it's not curative. And so we prefer MDMA-assisted therapy with the goal being to get to the core of the problem and help people resolve it so they don't need to take MDMA anymore at all. Or maybe occasionally, you know, if there's a relapse, they might need one more session or something like that. But the goal is really to help people learn how to heal themselves on their own after they've had these experiences with MDMA. Now, while we've been, 135 million over 36 years in donations, in the last couple of years, for-profit psychedelic companies have raised $2 billion. So we're not opposed to for-profits, but we just really think it's better, particularly in healthcare, for public benefit to be over profit. So the Navy SEAL Foundation has been willing, because they've heard of so many Navy SEALs going down to Mexico for Ibogaine and 5-MeO, for their TBI and PTSD and depression, that the Navy SEAL Foundation, their board of directors actually met to change their mission statement, because they were initially providing service for people with trauma or other indications, but they weren't authorized to support research. So they changed their mission so that they could support research. And their first research grant was to MAPS for our MDMA project. They can only give $150,000 a year for research. So that is that. Now, in 2010, Lori Sutton was still the highest ranking psychiatrist in the military. She started the National Center of Excellence for Psychological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury. And she contacted us after we published our first paper. And so we had a close relationship with her up to this day. She's very much supporting what we're doing. And now to think of this, in 2012, this was a quote, 10 years ago in the New York Times, that when it comes to the health and well-being of those who serve, we should leave our politics at the door and not be afraid to follow the data. There's now an evidence base for this MDMA therapy and a plausible story about what may be going on in the brain to account for the effects. So, Lori Sutton has been tremendously helpful for us in the negotiations we've had to try to bring MDMA therapy into the Veterans Administration and then potentially also into DoD settings. Dan Crenshaw is former Navy SEAL, as you know, member of Congress from Texas, and he's been very supportive of what we're doing as well, because he's also heard so many of these stories. He actually has a every year in his district, he has a healthcare innovation meeting for his constituents, and he invited myself and John Levesque, who's here in the front row, who's a veteran that has been through our studies and had terrible PTSD before the studies, and now doesn't. So we've really been able to have bipartisan support. So in this era of culture wars, we've been really fortunate to have taken the healing potential of psychedelics so far out of these culture wars and into bipartisan support. Now, what does our therapy look like? It's not like scripted, like prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy. It's more open-ended. It's based on this alliance between the therapist and the participants. We actually have 8-hour sessions. So it's what we've designed our studies to do is to maximize therapeutic outcomes. So we have not approached this from a lens of what's the least expensive way we can get people just enough help so that the FDA would approve it. What we've been trying to do is how do we maximize outcomes? And then later we will see, where do we need to cut back for practical economic issues, if at all. So we have this 8-hour session, and during it, people take the MDMA at the beginning. About 2 hours later, they take half the amount that they initially took to extend it to an 8-hour session. And there's no script. We are supporting what's emerging. So, with prolonged exposure, you're supposed to have one index trauma, your worst trauma, and that's what you keep talking about. But with MDMA therapy, you can go through what we call the archaeology of trauma, people's layers and layers of trauma often. And we will follow and support where they go. We work with Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score. He's the principal investigator of our Boston site. And so there's sometimes trauma will come in the body where it's without a story. And so we encourage the expression of whatever form it comes in, memories or thoughts or emotions or physical pains or stretching or anything. So the direction of the session is sourced from the participants' experiences. And people eventually do get around to the trauma, but we let them do that in their own way. And we call this inner-directed therapy. And there's this, you could say, hypothesis that there's this inner healing intelligence. So we all know that our body heals itself and tries to restore its shape and function below the level of our conscious awareness. And so the theory is that there's something similar in our psyche, and that what emerges once you give a psychedelic drug, you could say there's a barrier between the conscious and the unconscious, and this barrier becomes more permeable as it does in dreams at night. And so we trust that whatever's emerging is what we want to support. So we do have a treatment manual, and we have an adherence criteria. It's up on the website. It's available for free for anybody. And our therapy training program, which we eventually hope to, perhaps some of you might want to volunteer to be in our training program. There's 3 parts of it. The first part is 100 hours. And some of that is online, some of that is in person. It's mostly watching videotapes of therapy sessions, and then talking about the treatment manual, the adherence criteria. The second part is optional. It will never be required, but we believe that therapists will be more effective if they have tried the drug themselves. So you wouldn't go to a meditation teacher who never meditated or a yoga teacher that never did yoga. We don't expect psychiatrists to get ECT if they want to give that to their patients, or we don't think that you should be taking antipsychotic drugs necessarily. But that's because the treatment itself is the ECT or is the drug. But in this case, the treatment is the therapy that's based on the relationship. And so we think that therapists will be more effective if they know what the drug does. And we do have 2 protocols from the FDA specifically for training of therapists to give them a legal context to take MDMA. And then the final part of our training is that we want to supervise therapists as they work with the first PTSD patient. And so it's all videotaped, and then we have our adherence raters review the videotapes, give feedback, and then once we're comfortable that the therapists know the method, then they're certified to go forward. Post-approval, should we get there, the therapists are not required to use our method in the sense we just want them to know it, but they could blend it with whatever else they've learned, EMDR or prolonged exposure or cognitive behavioral therapy. But this is what our training program is. And we eventually want this training program to be embedded in schools of psychiatry and psychotherapy. So we don't want to be the only trainer, and we're already trying to work with various universities and private training groups, things like that. So we want to train as many people as possible. Now, here's a bit of the neuroscience. PTSD changes your brain. You have hyperactive activity in the amygdala, decreased activity of the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus, where we put things into long-term storage. Memory is decreased activity as well. So this is the effect. PTSD changes your brain. MDMA changes your brain in the other way. And this is why I think it's so effective. It reduces activity in the amygdala so that you're not so reactive to fear-based memories. It increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, so you're able to sort of think clearly about triggers. Are they really signs of danger, or they're just reminding you of that? And then it increases fear connectivity so that you can actually take these traumatic memories and process them and put them into long-term storage. And so I think that's the key. And when you think about what's going on, you're basically taking trauma that's in the foreground, and it's always happening in dreams and nightmares. People are constantly reminded of it. They're hypervigilant, and it doesn't take it away. It's not like you take ecstasy and now everything's fine. It's not like that at all, but you're moving this traumatic memory from foreground to background. It's part of your story, but not the whole story. And then people can move on. So this was John. A rock changed my brain, MDMA changed it back. So it does stimulate, release serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, a bunch of hormones, in particular oxytocin, which is the hormone of love and connection. And I think that's a big aspect for why it helps with the therapeutic alliance. Now, researchers Will Doblin at Johns Hopkins wanted to do studies with octopuses. And octopuses, if you've seen My Octopus Teacher or others, you know that octopuses are solitary creatures. They diverged from the evolutionary about 600 million years ago from the human line, but they still process serotonin. And so Gould was wondering what happens if you give MDMA to an octopus. And so we happily provided her with some grams of MDMA, and it took her a while to figure out, but they put the MDMA in the water. Octopus goes in the water, absorbs the MDMA, and unfortunately their cameras broke, but when they were doing the experiment, but the octopuses now hang out with other octopuses. So there's something that's pre-verbal, pro-social, evolutionary conserved aspect to MDMA, as demonstrated in the octopus. Now, she's also done studies in mice. And so what she showed in mice, and this was published in Nature, is that it opens this critical period for social reward learning, but that the oxytocin release from MDMA then promotes new neural connections in prosocial areas of the brain, so that you actually get neuroplasticity and new neural connections. And that's why it could be that you could have a few or one experiences with MDMA, psilocybin, ayahuasca also does this, and then you're actually rewiring your brain. So this helps account for how there can be long-term changes from just a deep experience. Now, we have 36 years. So it took us from 1986 to 2000 to get the permission from FDA to do the phase 1 dose response safety study. And in 2000, we started the phase 2 pilot studies. And we did them in multiple countries. And 30 years after we started MAPS, we had the end of phase 2 meeting with FDA. And we presented data from 105 people from all these different studies. We were varying the dose, varying the therapeutic method, trying to figure out really how to design phase 3. And we tested all these different doses. Part of this was trying to address the double-blind problem. How do you do double-blind research with psychedelics where it's pretty obvious if you've taken them? And it's very difficult to do. My dissertation focused a lot on the double-blind problem and the methodology for persuading FDA and other regulatory agencies. But as it turned out, I was wrong. But fortunately, I still got my PhD. And we didn't learn that I was wrong until we started doing this research. And what I thought would be the approach would be therapy with low-dose MDMA, therapy with full-dose MDMA. And the challenge was to get the dose of MDMA that's high enough to cause confusion, but not so high that you get a lot of therapeutic benefit and then you'd never tell a difference between key groups. So what we showed is, to our surprise, that the 75 milligram dose was actually quite effective. Our normal dose before then was the 125 milligram. But what we found is that these lower doses were anti-therapeutic. They were like idea of you're taking off in an airplane and there's turbulence at the beginning, and only when you get a little bit higher above the clouds is sort of smooth sailing. And so the lower doses actually made people uncomfortable. They still got better, but they didn't get as much benefit as the people that got therapy without any MDMA at all. So we found also that the cause of PTSD was irrelevant, meaning that the SSRIs were better in women than in men and failed in combat-related PTSD. But our therapy worked in complex PTSD, war-related PTSD, any kind of PTSD. We did discover that this lower doses had this anti-therapeutic effect. We demonstrated safety in these favorable safety, and we had a medium to large effect size in all the different studies. Now, this is another important finding that we made that distinguishes MDMA from the classic psychedelics. So you may have heard that in the 50s and 60s, the work with LSD and psilocybin, that there was, and the recent research with psilocybin over the last 2 decades, that there's a correlation between the depth of the mystical experience and therapeutic outcomes. Now, why that is not exactly clear, but the depth of the mystical experience is indeed correlated with therapeutic outcomes. However, for MDMA, it is not. And so we use the same mystical experience questionnaire right there. 0.6 means a full mystical experience. So a lot of people score higher. This was some of our phase 2 studies. And so we demonstrated, though, with 2 different phase 2 studies that there is no correlation. So that also impacts our therapeutic method in that we're not trying to move people to a mystical experience. There can be benefits from that, the sense of connectivity, the sense of love, but it's not key to helping people get over their PTSD. So this was a police officer from Australia, moved to America. The program changed my life in a way that I enjoy every day. I feel alive every day. It's not all unicorns and rainbows. There are tough times, disagreements, conflict, and it's all there, but I get through that, and there's nothing like what my old life used to be. And this was on 60 Minutes in Australia. So again, this is part of this idea of bipartisan support has been to work not just with sexual assault or things like that, but work with first responders, veterans, firefighters, police officers as well. So it took us 30 years. We had this end of phase 2 meeting. You can see our 5-person team. You know, Big Pharma will bring whole bunches of people. This was all we needed. And we got permission to go to phase 3, and we also were granted a breakthrough therapy. And we went through an 8-month process to negotiate every aspect of the phase 3 design with FDA. That's called special protocol assessment. Most pharma companies don't do this because it delays getting to market. But most pharmaceutical companies don't have problems with double blind. They don't have controversial drugs like we do. So we felt it was essential to do this. And we ended up getting what's called an agreement letter, which means FDA is legally bound to approve MDMA if the study develops statistically significant evidence and there are no new safety problems. And the thing about MDMA, also psilocybin, LSD, is that they're unlike any drug that the FDA has ever regulated because they're illegal drugs, because they have been used in widespread use for quite a long time. Tens and tens of millions of people have used these drugs. So we have a very good idea of the risk profile. People are taking these drugs often impure with other medications that they're taking. So, you know, people are doing this in the riskiest circumstances. And so if you go to Medline right now and put in MDMA or ecstasy, there's over 5,000 papers, most of it about the risks of MDMA. And so we know an enormous amount. So we think it's unlikely we're going to see new safety problems, but that's our agreement with FDA. We have to do 2 100 phase 3 studies. And this is now our treatment approach. So there are, the FDA and also the European Medicines Agency agreed with us that what we should do is therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose MDMA. So the double blind, I would say, fails in 85% or so of the cases. There are cases where people are confused, both therapists and patients. But the FDA said that in the double blind often fails, where SSRIs have side effect profiles, people can tell who's in which group often. But what they said is the 2 main ways to reduce experimenter bias are random assignment, so everybody's similarly motivated, and then independent raters for the outcome. So we have a very complex system of CAPS-5, the clinician-administered PTSD scale raters, most of them trained from Boston VA, where the CAPS was developed. And it's all done by telemedicine, it's all random, so the raters don't know which group the people were in. And we have a pool large enough of over 20 raters, so they are randomly assigned to the people in the study, and we evaluate them you know, after each experimental session and the 2-month follow-up. So the raters don't even know where in the process the subject is. So the basic idea is that there's 12 of these 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions. 3 before the first MDMA for building the therapeutic alliance for preparation, and then 3 of these integrative therapy sessions after each 8-hour experimental session. So it's therapy with inactive placebo. The first session is now 80 milligrams, followed 2 hours later by 40. And most people then, they're given the option to go up to 120 milligrams. Over 90% of the people do. And then they get 60 milligrams after 2 hours, and the same for the third session. It's also optional. So we do this 2-month follow-up, and that's to show that it's not about a psychedelic afterglow. It's sufficiently long after the last experimental session. And that's to get it approved. But this is 42 hours of therapy, and it's with a 2-person team, male, female often, but not always. And if it's not durable, these effects, the insurance companies won't pay for it because it's very labor intensive at the beginning. So we do a 1-year follow-up as well. And we're doing very long-term follow-ups now. We've done some up to an average of 3.5 years, some people up to 7 years. So it does seem for most people to be durable. There are people that relapse as well, but I think that our conversations with insurance companies so far have been very promising. But this is the treatment method. And again, as I said, we went to the European Medicines Agency. They said that they will accept the US data. We only have to do 1 phase 3 study in Europe, and they requested that we enroll refugees and migrants. which is a big issue in Europe and also here in America. And so we're going to be doing that as well. We're now training the European therapists. If we have FDA and EMA approval, we can get approval in most of the rest of the countries of the world, except for Russia, China, and Japan. Japan wants, because of their unique genetics, wants you to do another phase 3 study inside Japan. Russia is so repressive that there is no research with psychedelics, and China is also not permitted it at the moment. But everywhere else, we'll be able to get approval with just training local therapists. And so we're in 7 countries and 10 sites in Europe as well. So we published our first phase 3 study in Nature Medicine in May 10th, year 2021. And I'll briefly go over the results of that with you. So we're also very focused on public education. And so we had worked with the New York Times to prepare them for when this paper was going to be published. And so they were very positive about it. The psychedelic drug pass is a big test, our first phase 3 study. There's hundreds now of for-profit psychedelic companies, but we're the only one in phase 3. The psilocybin for depression, for treatment-resistant depression, is probably going to go to phase 3 early next year. But right now, we are the only ones in phase 3. And as I said, yesterday was the last data point in our second phase 3 study. So New York Times actually published 2 articles 2 weeks in a row about it. Psychiatry may never be the same. Science at the end of the year reviews the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the year all over the world. And there's 1 winner and 9 runner-ups. And at the end of 2021, Science said that our phase 3 study was one of the world's top 10 breakthroughs. So it was very satisfying to receive it. And it was even more satisfying because 20 years before, Science had published a paper that they never should have published, done out of Hopkins here, with primates claiming that MDMA could hurt dopamine and could cause Parkinson's. There was a bunch of things that didn't make sense of the study. A bunch of the primates died from overdoses. But still, they went ahead and they published this paper. Alan Leshner, the head of AAAS, used to be the director of NIDA, funded a lot of this research. He said, using ecstasy is like playing Russian roulette with your brain function, kind of inflammatory. And but we challenged this, and they spent a year trying to replicate the results, which they could not do. They didn't tell us this, but they kept trying to replicate the results. And then eventually they had to retract the paper because it turned out they had mistakenly given methamphetamine instead of MDMA. And methamphetamine is stronger than MDMA, so that they're giving methamphetamine in MDMA doses. So basically they proved that MDMA does not hurt dopamine. Their whole year of trying to replicate the results and not being able to do that. So this was that sort of high watermark of the fears about MDMA neurotoxicity. And right now, there's no issue anymore with the FDA about neurotoxicity. We only give MDMA a few times. There's no evidence that the doses we use are above any kind of a threshold. So this was particularly satisfying for us that 20 years after this, Science would declare MDMA research to be one of the top 10 breakthroughs of the world. So our phase 3 design, it's chronic PTSD, severe chronic PTSD. We do use inactive placebo. We had 15 sites. We actually took our main therapists for phase 2 out of phase 3 so that they would train new therapists. And so we also wanted to have multiple sites, and we have sites in Israel, Canada, and the United States. CAPS-5 is the measure, and then we will do both the 2-month and then a longer-term follow-up. Now, we had 90 people. We were supposed to be 100, but then because of COVID, we had to shut the study down, and the FDA agreed that we could end the study with 90 people. And 1/3 of them, 30 out of the 90, their principal trauma occurred during childhood. 84% had some childhood trauma. We have 2/3 are women, 1/3 is men. The veterans get the most attention in the media, but most of the people in America, most of the people in the world that have PTSD are from sexual assault, or, although there's more and more, refugees, other kind of trauma from other conditions as well. But we had a substantial number of veterans. Sadly, we also we had a site in Boulder, so we had some people from the Columbine shooting. So we have, you can see again, PTSD from a range of causes. we feel that because of the stigma of MDMA, we have to work with the hardest cases. So people had PTSD an average of 14 years, but more than a third had PTSD for over 20 years. We even had someone with PTSD from Vietnam who was able to get better. So you can be stuck with PTSD for almost half a century, and you can still get better. Okay. Now, with suicidal ideation, unlike some studies with PTSD, we enroll people who have previously attempted suicide. And so you can see that over 90% had positive ideation. Serious ideation was almost more than a third, but positive behavior is substantial. So this is just to say that we are working with people that are really struggling and have not got relief in other ways. And this is the description of our results. The top line is therapy without MDMA. The bottom line is therapy with MDMA. And you can see these dots are after each MDMA, after the first, the second, and the third. And so the distance keeps growing the more MDMA sessions there are. So what that means to us is that there's this cumulative effect of the MDMA therapy over the therapy without MDMA. But people still do okay, many of them just with the therapy. And we had a p-value there of 0.0001. So 1 in 10,000, the chances that it was random. We also do work, of course, about 90% of the people have PTSD, also have depression in our study. We've not studied depression without PTSD, but that's something that we want to do in the future. And then functional impairment also goes down. What we showed is that at the 2-month follow-up here, 32% of the people that got therapy without MDMA no longer had PTSD, no longer qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD. But when you add MDMA, it's 67%. It's more than twice as much. And an additional 21% had clinically significant reductions of PTSD symptoms, even though they still had PTSD. And if they would have had more time or one more session, maybe they would be under this limit. But in phase 2, it's somewhat similar, but it was less. We had 23% in the control groups. Now, this control group actually is both combined people that got therapy with inactive placebo and people that got therapy with low-dose MDMA. So that's where we set it in, anti-therapeutic effect. This is the group, 56% in our phase 2 studies no longer had PTSD at the 2-month follow-up, but at the 1-year follow-up, we don't have the data yet for the first phase 3 study, but it was up to 68%. So people keep getting better on their own. Between the 2-month and the 1 year, we don't do anything. They can do whatever they want. They can do more therapy. They can not do more therapy. But there is this way in which people learn how to process their trauma. And the essence of what we're trying to do is to teach people that they can heal themselves, and that they are the ones that are the agent of healing. And so they need to do that on their own afterwards. Right? So what we showed also is people on the dissociative subtype, which is considered the hardest to treat, actually did better than everybody else on average. And I think they're so hungry for that ability to process the trauma, which is so frightening to them, that once they have a way that they can do it, then they respond really, really well. Another way to look at it is effect size. You can see Zoloft and Paxil, the only drugs approved for PTSD. An effect size of 1 is 1 standard deviation from the norm. That's considered to be very large effect size. And the FDA approves drugs here based on 0.31, 0.37. Paxil is barely 0.56 in the medium. And then we had 2 ways to tell our effect size. One is placebo subtractive. But since our placebo is really therapy, we're basically, when we subtract the placebo group, you're left with the effect of MDMA. And so when you do that, it's 0.91, very large effect size. But when you look within subjects, the people that have MDMA plus therapy, it's a 2.1 effect size. So very remarkable, 2 standard deviations from the norm. There were no side effects. What that means is that most of the data isn't coming from highly experienced therapists. That's, as I said, it's 15 sites, it's equally distributed. It's in part because we think the quality of our therapy training program, and also because therapeutic potential of MDMA. This means for us that it's scalable. We do want to train 25,000 therapists in this decade, and we do think that it is going to be scalable. There are side effects. These are minor. Every one of these is more in the MDMA group than in the placebo group. But these are minor, transient, during the MDMA experience, muscle tightness, decreased appetite, sweating. So none of these are serious, and they all fade after time. But more serious ones, we did not have anything that was greater in the MDMA group than in the placebo group. We had cardiovascular here. Sort of this is more suicidality, not active attempts, but a little bit more suicidality, more in the placebo group and MDMA group. And then we didn't have anybody report to us that after the therapy they went and used MDMA or ecstasy on their own. That may have happened, but we don't. MDMA is out of your blood in a couple of days, so there's really no way to really verify this. But we didn't see it. And we did have, in terms of serious adverse events, we had a very sad situation of one woman tried to kill herself twice during the study, and another self-hospitalized with severe suicidation, but both were in the placebo group. And we had nothing like that in the MDMA group. And so far, we've not had any of these serious adverse events in the second phase 3 study in either group. So as far as we know, we're going to have probably a good safety profile as well. So we had a small p-value, large effect size, replicated phase 2 results, no site variability, and no increase in suicidality. Safety was fine. This is an interesting slide. We've combined two studies. The VA just published a study recently in 900 veterans, and they were comparing cognitive processing therapy with prolonged exposure. And so the two lines, these are the data points from the VA study. It took them about 6 years to do. No statistically significant differences between their two approaches. And you can see we superimposed on top of it our first phase 3 data. And so we started with people with a higher CAPS scores, but and then we ended up the best. But the important part is up here. For prolonged exposure, 55.8% of the people dropped out of the study. The therapy was re-traumatizing. For CPT, it was 46%. For MDMA, it's only 6.5%. So we keep people in the therapy, and I think that there's a way that people, once they realize that they can process their trauma in a different way, they are hopeful. And so I think from a suicidality prevention point of view, I think MDMA can have an incredible contribution to help people feel. John?
For the MDMA dropout rate, how many of those dropped out because they believed that they were healed and required no further treatment, and how many dropped because of issues with the actual therapy, such as like with prolonged exposure?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question is, why did people drop out from the MDMA? The answer is that in phase 2, we did have some people that dropped out because they didn't think that they needed 3 sessions. They thought they were cured and they didn't need to do it anymore. I don't think that happened in this study, but the way in which we have designed the study, it has to be the same for everybody. So there's only 1 month apart of the MDMA sessions. And I think the people that dropped out needed more time to integrate, and they weren't ready for the second MDMA session. So post-approval, people will be able to judge when is the right time, when people have integrated what happened before. But sometimes people do need more time. But I think this dropout rate is really going to be the key factor of why more and more we will be trying to work with the hardest cases with MDMA-assisted therapy. So as I said, the last data point in our second phase 3 study was yesterday. Okay, I just got a few minutes. I'll try to be fast. So our interim analysis said we had a 90% or greater probability. And the key issue for us is safety. Were there any serious adverse events? And so far, none. This is our path to approval, just to give you a sense. In early 2024 is when we think we'll have FDA approval, then DEA rescheduling is within 90 days. And this is when we think we can launch. The REMS, so how does this get done? As I said, the REMS is the risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. The idea here is that it's only going to be administered under direct supervision and only by trained therapists. And prescribers will have special training. There'll be special safety screenings, and MDMA increases blood pressure, so we don't work with people with uncontrolled hypertension. So this is still under negotiation, but this is what we think is likely to be. We did have formal dispute resolution with FDA. For a while, they wanted the lead person to be MD PhD, and they didn't want to give approval for the second protocol to give MDMA to therapists. And they also said that they wanted to have a physician on site. We don't need these things for phase 3, and we protested, and FDA didn't respond, and eventually we appealed to the Office of Neuroscience, and then everything was reversed in our favor. So the lead person doesn't need to be MD, PhD, just licensed to do therapy. We do have the protocol, clinical hold removed, to give MDMA to therapists, and the physician needs to be do the screening, but then on call doesn't need to be on site. If we succeed in adults, we are required to do work in pediatric populations, 12 to 17-year-olds. And if that works, we have to go down to 7 to 11-year-olds. And also what we want to do is we require people to taper off their SSRIs. SSRIs blunt the effect of MDMA. And so there's a lot of people that don't want to go off their SSRIs. And what we've heard, and we need to test this, is that when you give larger amounts of MDMA, you can overwhelm the SSRIs, people can have a full MDMA experience. The concern is serotonin syndrome, but we don't see that happening. So we need to do a really controlled safety study here with this. This is just now very quick. I'll just tell you that we are recognizing, again, MDMA is a tool that can be used in multiple different ways. So the VA, the very first project in 2014 that they approved us to do was with Candace Monson. She worked for the Boston VA as Deputy Director of Women's Health and developed cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. So we gave MDMA to 6 dyads. The results were great and better than anything they'd ever got without it, both in reduction of PTSD and strength of the relationship. And so now we've raised money. She's doing 60 dyads, 30 with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy without MDMA, normal, and 30 with MDMA up in Toronto. And then we're moving to do this stuff inside the VA as well. We're combining MDMA with cognitive processing therapy by Ian Wagner, also in Toronto. Our Rothbaum is going to combine MDMA with prolonged exposure. And Edna Foa is also doing it. She developed prolonged exposure. So again, almost done, super fast. And then this is just to let you know that October 12th, 2021, we've been trying for almost 30 years to get this into the VA, and we finally succeeded. So the first veteran inside the VA got treated October 12th, 2021. We're working with Rachel Yehuda at the Bronx VA. She's going to compare 2 sessions versus 3 sessions. She's also done epigenetics of transmission of trauma done with Holocaust survivors and their children. So she's using epigenetic measures also in this. We're starting a group therapy study at the Portland, Oregon VA. We think group therapy offers a lot of potential to reduce costs. Maybe you could, in the Palo Alto VA, another bigger controlled study with cognitive processing therapy. The National Center for PTSD is interested in comparing MDMA with other treatments. And then they also wanted to see compared with an active comparator. So this will be at the West LA VA comparing therapy with MDMA with D-amphetamine. Leslie Moreland at the San Diego VA is going to compare MDMA with cognitive processing therapy. And then in Phoenix, this is also, actually this should say cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. So sorry, that slide is wrong. We think that there'll eventually be like 6,000 clinics or so in America. And this is what the clinics will look like, meaning that the therapists will be cross-trained in MDMA, ketamine, and psilocybin. And you will go to a clinic and they will sort of customize a treatment program for you. This is the last slide. And so we're having the world's biggest conference on psychedelics ever in June of 2023 in Denver. So we'd like to invite you all there. And now I look forward to questions and a dialogue. So thank you very much for having me here today. The Q&A session will be in the healing